Hello, everyone. Welcome to another UAA Professional Development Seminar Series. Our speaker today is Kyle Alvarado. Kyle is a PhD student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He received his bachelor's in mechanical engineering from UAA, his master's at UAF, and now pursuing a doctorate at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Kyle works with scientists around the world to design alternative food production methods for Earth during an agricultural disaster. Thanks very much, Kyle, for giving us a talk today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and good morning. Today I'll be discussing the application of engineering in food security. So as mentioned, I'm part of two affiliations, the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, or ALFED, which is an effective altruism organization. It's a nonprofit, and it's a really great organization. It includes scientists from around the world. Currently, I'm working with scientists and engineers from Spain, Italy, and Australia, which does make it a little hard to make meetings, but it's good anyway. The second organization that funds me is the Alaska Space Grant Program, which itself is from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Since we're all familiar with NASA, I wanted to give a little bit more introduction to ALFED. ALFED started with a book. It was published by my advisor in around 2015. And since it was published, about 5 times as much research has been completed. Basically, what the book showed was research and planning strategy for agricultural catastrophe preparedness. And essentially, it showed the technical feasibility of how to feed people during an agricultural catastrophe. So now a little bit more background on catastrophes and their solutions. The first thing I want to define is what a global catastrophic risk is, or in other words, a GCR. It's a type of existential risk that threatens the civilization or existence of humanity. Particularly what types of GCRs I've been focusing on in terms of research are sun blocking scenarios. These include most severely nuclear winter, asteroid impact, or supervolcanic eruption. These scenarios involve about a 10 degrees Celsius global temperature drop, and 50% of the sun would essentially be blocked from reaching the surface. And disturbingly, there's about a 10% chance of this occurring within the next 80 years. The problem with one of these scenarios is that there would be a lack of food production and billions of people would starve. Some examples of GCRs that have a 80% chance of occurring this century, and these would cause about a 10% global food shortfall, include, starting top left, we have abrupt climate change. There would also be extreme climate change that is slow. There could be a volcano or a drought, or asteroid impact, super weed or super disease or super pest. We could also lose beneficial bacteria or lose bees. Also, quite severely, we could have a nuclear war, which would cause nuclear winter and the burning of cities. And then something that we have a little bit of familiarity with is a pandemic. However, in order to cause a more severe food shortfall, you need to be a little bit more severe, like the bubonic plague, for instance. We have seen, though, with this pandemic that there have been losses in some foods, but not caloric foods that give us actual calories, but stuff like spice or some more expensive stuff. And then some scenarios that would cause 100% global food shortfall might be abrupt climate change or asteroid impact or supervolcano or nuclear winter. One thing to mention here in terms of difference is that abrupt climate change is sort of separate from the other three, whereas it's a little bit more immediate and less severe than the other three. So for example, the probability of abrupt climate change is in the order of magnitude of 1 in 10 per century, which would be similar to nuclear winter. However, the time to recovery after abrupt climate change would be about 100 years, whereas nuclear winter would only be about 10. And then in terms of qualitative intensity, abrupt climate change is medium, whereas nuclear winter would be high. So the solutions to these might involve crafty thinking. The most apparent solution is to store up food. The problem with that, though, is that that would cost more than $10 trillion, and a lot of people wouldn't be able to afford that. So the next apparent solution would be to grow crops using artificial light photosynthesis. So basically growing food indoors using artificial light. However, with all of current electricity production, we would only be able to feed about 5% of people. So the more crafty solution is to think of alternative foods. By definition, they're inexpensive to prepare for, so they can save expected lives cheaply. The purpose of an alternative food is to produce food quickly and efficiently and to feed them cost effectively, so that not only can we get enough food to people, but those people can afford it. Now to define an alternative food, it's basically a source of calories from an unconventional source or process. It may even involve retrofitting current industry. And again, by definition, they're quickly deployable and low cost. Some sources of alternative food include some low-tech solutions like greenhouse crop production or seaweed farming. And then some of the higher tech sources are bacteria or non-biological synthesis of carbs or fats. Bacteria have been shown to be rather useful since there's a lot that could provide different types of nutrients, or even if their sole purpose is for protein or carbs. We've been working with hydrogen oxidizing bacteria, electric consuming bacteria, and methane digesting bacteria. Some other sources of alternative food are mushrooms, cellulosic sugar, insects, or ruminants. The resources that we can take to make food is rather vast as well. You can make food from almost anything, whether it be biomass or petroleum, coal, gas, oil, or capturing CO2 from the atmosphere or using it for taking it from industrial processes. And we can also take leaves and make protein from it. So now I'm going to talk about a project that I completed on a low-tech solution, basically growing crops in a greenhouse. To set the stage a little, I looked at constructing these greenhouses during a nuclear winter. So this is an example of what the world would look like one year into a nuclear winter during summer. For example, in the top left, we have the global surface temperature. And what we take away from this is that the surface temperature would be basically freezing anywhere outside of the tropical latitudes. So any non-cold tolerant crop wouldn't be able to grow basically outside of the tropics. In the top right.
All right. We do have a question. Yeah. So the question is, will you talk about BRC, ISO 9000, or ISO 2200?
I'm not exactly sure what those are.
Okay. All right. We will move on. Thank you.
Yeah, feel free to elaborate on that question now. So the top right figure is of total precipitation. And what this shows us is anywhere that's not orange or yellow or red would be rather low precipitation, possibly to the point where crops wouldn't be able to grow without additional water besides what's rained down. So after a quick calculation, though, it was determined that even these little red spots are enough area to grow crops to feed the world. The bottom left figure is relative humidity, and this basically shows that the relative humidity would go up, which is actually beneficial for our situation for growing crops in greenhouses. And I'll explain that on the next slide. That bottom right figure is the basically how much sunlight would reach the surface, and that is somewhat related to the temperature as well, and basic crop productivity would also be required in that tropical region. A little bit more about crop resilience. In the tropics, we'd still get 12 hours per day of sunlight, even during a GCR. However, pre-GCR, usually crops would require about 4 millimeters per day of precipitation when grown outdoors. However, with this GCR scenario, the increased relative humidity with reduced solar intensity and with similar temperature would actually reduce the water requirements, according to literature. There would still be one problem though, which is with long day obligate crops. These are crops, some long day obligate crops require more than 12 hours per day of sunlight in order to flower. So it's, according to literature, about 110 lux night lighting is required minimum for these long day obligate crops in order to recognize the light to continue growing. Now, even in civil twilight, which is sometime after the sun has set, we could still get 110 lux. But for the crops that would require even more light than that, a little bit of artificial light would be needed. It is a pretty negligible amount of crops, though, that would require this. In order to determine the production rate of what these crops would produce, I took an average of 8 crops produced worldwide. These crops include potato, yam, sweet potato, rice paddy, shell groundnut, wheat, lentil, and cassava. And these represent about 50% of the total crop production in the world. Combining these with their respective weights, we get about 3.1 dry tons per hectare per year from this quote unquote average crop. And to determine how much of this we need to feed the world, we take the fact that the energy density of a dry carb is about 4 calories per gram, and that human nutrition is 2,100 calories per day, and there's about 7 billion people on it. The structure of these low-tech greenhouses were designed from established literature. So we took the A-frame design. It could also be a hoop house, so with a semicircle on top. But the A-frame was selected to utilize light in the tropics for sun that would be directly overhead. Then the fastener distribution for fastening the structure together, as well as the polymer cover on top and on the sides. That was also taken from literature. And a water retention method, which basically funnels the rainwater down into the greenhouse, stores it into a retention pool, and irrigates it through channels, would also be used to get to crops that don't receive direct precipitation. And again, these are low-tech designs, so they're based on very low-tech materials like sticks and basic plastic, although these are pretty hefty sticks, more like timber. So this is what a 6 meter by 3 meter unit cell would look like. Again, basically taking rough dimensions of what the beams and columns would look like of our wood for the frame, and our polymer film, which would be our cover. And then the fasteners could be nails or ties or lashing or glue welds. And for water retention and irrigation, be using gravel and clay. And that would also be used to actually to secure the foundation of the frame itself. So this is an assembly of global markets to determine exactly how many greenhouses we can build per year. And then, of course, to get the cost for it as well. So for forestry products, we have the volume in dollar, and then the same for polymer film and sheet, which would be for the cover. And then similarly for fasteners and construction aggregates. All these values are in annual values. So it's considered though that these can be scaled down to a monthly value. And if it turned out that we would need to use all of one material for constructing greenhouses, then it's also considered that if the demand for food was high enough, then this would be economically justified, which the demand for food would probably be high enough. The expansion rate of these greenhouses would be material dependent. So it was, after a quick calculation, it was determined that the expansion rate would be the polymer film and sheet extrusion. Using all polymer film and sheet, it would production per year, it would allow 41 million hectares per year of greenhouse construction. Using our 3.1 dry tons per hectare per year of crop production, this would feed about 15% of the world in 12 months of construction. Moreover, since the service life of the polymer would be only 3 years in this scenario, this would probably need to be enhanced. And then furthermore, the first 12 months after the catastrophe are the most critical, because that's most likely when stored food would be depleted. So the solution would be to manufacture 1.5 times as many current extruders. This would double the area of greenhouse construction, and we could keep the polymer extrusion industry open. And how this would break down is basically allocating 2 times of the current extruder demand to greenhouse construction and keeping half of the current extruder demand open to maintaining conventional uses. And again, so even this reduction in half of current extruder demand would be economically justified if the demand for food was high enough. So even with that,
All
sorry, was
right.
there a question?
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up on that earlier question. So has anyone taken a look at national food safety standards or international food safety standards yet for this?
Yeah, that's actually another project is working on that. But yes, we do align with, I believe, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And
Awesome.
Food security and food safety. Yep.
Thank you.
Even with the doubled expansion of polymer extrusion, polymer film and sheet would still be our limiting factor in terms of how much greenhouse area we could construct per year. With the forestry products, which would be sawn wood and wood fuels, we could construct 95 million hectares per year of greenhouses. And then behind that would be polymer film and sheet, which would allow us to construct about 83 million hectares per year. And then without competition would be steel nails for our fasteners, which would allow roughly 126 million hectares per year. The scaling approach for increasing the yield of crops was also taken from literature, and it's actually a common practice in horticulture to do this as well. And it involves a crop transplantation method and the fact that young crops have a higher root to shoot ratio. So basically what this means is the young plants having a higher root proportion compete for soil nutrients more effectively, whereas plants with a higher shoot proportion, which is those older plants, would focus more on collecting light energy instead of competing for those soil nutrients. So they would require more space. So therefore, the limit to transplantation would be the future available greenhouse space. So how this would work is you would build your first set of greenhouses in the first month, and you could plant at 3 times density, because at about 2 months, that's when the crops would need to be transplanted, because that's when they'd be mature enough to need their own space. So after 2 months, you would build another set of greenhouses and leave that set of greenhouses open without planting in it. After 3 months, you would have another set of greenhouses constructed. And then at that point, your first greenhouse would have 3 times density of crops at 2 months of age. So then you would retransplant those crops into your 2 empty sets of greenhouses. So instead of having 1 greenhouse with 2 months of age, 1 greenhouse with 1 month of age, and 1 greenhouse with no months of age, you would now have 3 greenhouses with 2 months of age, making 6 months of age total. And that's further illustrated in this figure. And I included a 1 month delay after the catastrophe hits to start reallocating materials and start building greenhouses. But basically, after that, at that first harvest, you would harvest at 3 times density instead of just harvesting the first greenhouse at 1 times density, which we call the plant and wait method. And we can see that the transplant method actually diverges from the plant and wait method. And you can basically plant at whatever density the crops allow you to plant at safely. In terms of labor, there's 2 types of labor that was considered. There's the building labor and the farming labor. If there's no labor exhaustion or loss in productivity or problems during shipping or material losses, then this would equate to about 96 million builders. The construction labor would be constant for the first 36 months while they construct greenhouses at a constant rate, whereas the latter 36 months would be designated to replacing the polymer film, because the polymer film would only last about 3 years. So your 36 months of greenhouses would then need replacement of the polymer film, and you would reduce the construction labor for that because you're not constructing greenhouses anymore. The farming labor would be borrowed from the current agricultural labor force, which, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, there are a staggering 1.3 billion jobs from agriculture worldwide. That farming labor would grow for the first 3 years and then remain constant as the constructors just replace the polymer film. The cost of construction and replacement over this 72 months, which is the intense phase of the catastrophe, would be broken down like this. So the initial 36 months of construction would cost about 70% materials and 30% labor. Whereas the latter 36 months, which is just the replacement of polymer, that would basically be 50-50 materials and labor. Now that latter 36 months is future value. So using engineering economics, we bring that to a present value, and then just add the initial and latter 36 months to get a total cost of greenhouses. And as a result, we can take that cost and divide it by the total mass of food that we produce from these greenhouses to get the final added cost to food, which would be at retail about $2.30 per dry kilogram. In relation, this would increase the cost of rice by about 160%. And even so, this price includes the cost of some artificial light for those very few long day obligate crops. In comparison, the closed artificial light growing system would add around $600 per dry kilogram. And the reason for this is because the greenhouses still use natural light, and the electricity to biomass conversion is rather inefficient. Moreover, the closed systems need precise environmental control, which can be expensive. And then as a final result, this is what our scaling method shows us, is that we can feed 40% of the global population after just 12 months of construction. And then at month 27, we could feed 100% of the people. The reason this graph goes above 100%, it actually goes to about 160%, is because it's to utilize the maximum, get the maximum amount of profit from our greenhouses that we're constructing. And it's also to, that extra 60% of food production could go to other biomass needs, or feeding pets or ruminants. And we could also produce stuff that other crops might be able to grow, like cotton or oil.
All right, question answered. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the next project that I looked at was a high-tech solution on hydrogen oxidizing bacteria. Hydrogen oxidizing bacteria, or HOB, is one of 3 projects funded by the Alaska Space Grant Program. And similar to that low-tech solution, it's an alternative food. So the purpose of it is to avoid growing food with artificial light and the storage of food. We looked at 3 scenarios for each of these projects, including for the Earth during a GCR, in space, and on Earth in a terrestrial or aquatic refuge, or possibly for a small community. And that would relate to our space mission as well. A little bit more about HOB. If you pasteurize bacteria, then it's a single cell protein. The pasteurization of HOB was first developed in 1965, and soon after it was experimented with from NASA. The species that I looked at was Cuperovidus necator, which has a 63% protein content and 6% carb. The Finnish food company called Solar Foods uses a similar species, and their product, they say, looks and tastes just like wheat flour. So you could bake from it or make pancakes or whatever. It would taste similar. So this is what an upstream section of the hydrogen of the HOB system would look like. Your inputs would be nitrogen and minerals into fermentation. You would also add CO2, which is the inorganic energy source. And you would basically capture that from either the air or industrial or in space that's already set up for CO2 capture. And since it is hydrogen consuming bacteria, you would need a hydrogen source. And you can get that from splitting water via electrolysis. And then you also get the product of oxygen, which could go to people. So from this fermentation, you get water and the HOB cells. And in the downstream section, we input that into some more steps and adding a little bit more electricity and fuel. We get the actual SCP powder and water, purified water that could go to drinking or to actually rehydrating the SCP powder. And that SCP powder is edible. Research was completed for HOB on Earth, and it was determined that the total capital cost would be between 1.4 and 4.8 trillion dollars to fulfill the global protein needs. And the reason for this difference is because it depends on the process choice and also the protein content of the SCP itself. What I focused on was more on the space side, and it was to develop a more sustainable food source for space missions. The current food source for space missions is prepackaged food. However, it's not long-term sustainable. So what other groups are looking at is microalgae single-cell protein, which involves artificial light photosynthesis, which we've determined is expensive. However, since the dominant cost of a space mission is its fuel, the solution instead is to reduce the mass of food. So the HOB, even though I'm comparing it to these other two systems, prepackaged food and microalgae, it's not meant to be the exclusive food source realistically. More realistically, it would be a portion of the food, and it would reduce part of, for example, prepackaged food. However, for this analysis and for simplicity of calculation, I did look at it as HOB, microalgae, and prepackaged food individually being 100% of the food source. And I believe that's more of a fair comparison for all of them. So I looked at 3 distinct missions, including the International Space Station, the Moon, and Mars. Each of these missions would have a crew of 5 people, and it would last a duration of 3 years. And this example was taken from literature. NASA, to compare systems, they use a technique called equivalent system mass, or ESM. And the basic parameters of the ESM are apparent mass, pressurized onboard volume, power, cooling, then there's crew time, and then time-dependent mass and volume. Crew time and time-dependent variables were considered not to have an effect on our 3 food systems that we're comparing. So we neglected those for this calculation, but instead we just focused on the apparent mass, power, cooling, and pressurized volume. The variable in the very front of that equation, which is LEQ, is called the location factor. And that's required a little bit more evaluation from literature. But basically, for all of this ESM to equate to one variable, which is mass, or kilograms, you have to multiply for example, the volume by its equivalency factor. So if the volume was in cubic meters, then its equivalency factor would be taken from NASA literature, would be kilograms per cubic meter, and same with power and cooling in kilowatts. So that would be kilograms per kilowatt. So to determine the location factor, I had to consider the mission segments for this mission, or for all 3 missions, which would have similar mission segments. And basically what these mission segments are acceleration requirements. So that's when you would need to use fuel. So 1 would be from Earth's surface to low Earth orbit, or LEO. And then 2 would be LEO to another body's orbit. And then the body's orbit to the body's surface. And then whatever the 3 years, or whatever remaining time of the 3 years spent on surface. Then the surface back to orbit, and then the orbit to LEO, and the LEO back to Earth's surface. All of those would require different accelerations. The literature on this is rather sparse in terms of location factors, but in order to compare all 3 systems, we only need 1 location factor. So to combine those, I took whatever we had on current literature from NASA, which would be based on the shuttle type and then engine type as well. So 1 location factor was determined by just basic arithmetic.
All right, so this question is maybe a little off topic, but the question is, what should the screws and nails of a mixer machine for food be like in a food factory to prevent the screws or nails from getting into the food in packaging?
I'm not really sure if I know how to answer that. So there's actually current, so with an alternative food, for example, Solar Foods, which is a Finnish food company that produces the single cell protein from HOB, they actually have an established procedure for doing this food, and it's edible, and they do produce it for commercial or for consumer use. So yeah, I guess the design of the food system wouldn't necessarily need to be novel for these types of global catastrophes. So ideally, there would not need to be any research done, and these plants are existing. So yeah, current designs would be used for the global catastrophes.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully that answers the question. So for ESM equivalent system mass considerations on each one of these parameters, which again were apparent mass, volume, power, and cooling, we took each component of the food system, so water, CO2, oxygen, food, and any additional infrastructure. And so just naming some differences here. The carbon dioxide would be a product of the astronaut's metabolism, whereas for our two microorganisms, HOB and microalgae, they would be consumed for growing, since they're autotrophic. However, so with that CO2, which is a product of the astronaut's metabolism, they somehow need to eject that. And so the way that they do that is via something called a Sabatier reactor, where they combine CO2 with hydrogen to form methane gas and water. The water can then go to the crew, but the methane gas needs to be ejected, which is extra, not only extra mass, but extra power as well, extra power requirement. In terms of additional infrastructure, which would add to the apparent mass, prepackaged food would have none, whereas our microorganisms would obviously need a bioreactor and additional power supply for that bioreactor. A little more on that, additional power requirements. Prepackaged food would need the full use of something called an environmental control life support system, or ECLSS, whereas ideally the microorganisms would produce, they produce one byproduct of them is oxygen, and again they reduce CO2. So ideally they would not need the full use of the ECLSS, which again is just environmental control. And then in terms of thermal or cooling, since it's a closed system, we're setting the heat rejection equal to the power. So of course the power in equals the heat out. In terms of crew time, that was neglected for basically all systems. Prepackaged food wouldn't have any anyway. And then for our microorganisms, according to our NASA correspondent, the crew is given, is allocated time to doing stuff like operating and maintenance and cleaning. In terms of waste, prepackaged food would have several, including food packaging and human waste and contaminants, and then that methane gas that needs to be ejected. Whereas the microorganisms would ideally not have much waste, if any. And they could also potentially in the future convert human waste and contaminants into nutrients for people. To get a final power requirement for each of our microorganisms, we took the net reaction for an HOB system, which has inputs of water, CO2, and ammonia. And we found that the Cucurbitacea necator, or HOB species, has an overall electricity to biomass efficiency of 18%, which is pretty outstanding. Whereas Spirulina platensis, the M2 strain of microalgae, has about a 4% overall efficiency, which is also pretty significant compared to artificial light grown crops, which are at about 0.3%. So these are the final results between our two different microorganisms. HOB is significantly favorable in every aspect compared to microalgae, mostly due to its volumetric productivity, which is 48 kilograms dry per cubic meter per day, as compared to microalgae, which is 3 kilograms per cubic meter per day. The energy density is similar to that of a dry carb for both, 4.78, or which is 4 kilograms per cubic meter, or 4 calories per gram. The bioreactor volume is also significantly in favor to HOV, which again is converted to mass for the mission. 62 liter bioreactor as compared to just under an 1800 liter bioreactor to feed just 5 people. Similar with the setup mass. And then the chemical energy requirement of food, that's the conversion of the calorie requirement of 5 astronauts, which they require 2,800 calories per day. So it's converted into 684 watts. And then we get a final required power of the product. For HOV, it's 3.8 kilowatts, and for microalgae, it's 17.1 kilowatts. So then after obtaining all of our required parameters for ESM, we can finally calculate it for HOB, microalgae, and prepackaged food. And for all 3 missions, HOB is the favorable food choice. Again, this is for 100% exclusive food from, i.e. HOB or microalgae or 100% prepackaged food. HOB for all 3 missions, ISS, Moon, and Mars, is somewhere around 5.5 times less mass and therefore less cost than microalgae, and it's about 2 times less than prepackaged food. Now it's notable here that prepackaged food is still lower added mass to the mission than microalgae. However, the benefit that microalgae still has over prepackaged food is that it's a sustainable long-term food source, whereas prepackaged food is not. And these missions are just considering 3 years of food. Ideally, there would be 10 years or longer, even for certain missions. So this is an individual component contribution for each ESM of each food choice. We can see that the pressurized volume has almost negligible contribution to each food source. However, for prepackaged food, as expected, most of its added mass is from the apparent mass itself, so the mass of the food. And then there's very little for the power and heat rejection. And again, the power is equal to the heat rejection. Whereas for the HOB and microalgae, it's basically a 3-way split between the apparent mass, power, and heat rejection. And again, these are all converted into kilograms of added mass to the mission. So now I'm going to discuss some current research, which is the other 2 NASA projects, electroactive bacteria and non-biological synthesis. Electroactive bacteria, we started researching this because of their importance in converting waste. They can produce electricity or use electricity as their energy source. And more importantly, they can convert stuff like ammonia or carbon dioxide into edible products. Like we saw with HOB, you can pasteurize the bacteria into single-cell protein. Moreover, they can be used in microbial electrosynthesis for producing edible byproducts. Like EAB, for example, could produce acetic acid, which at 5% dilution is vinegar, which is edible calories. This is a microbial fuel cell diagram, which basically explains that the input would be water, and you would electrolyze that to get electrons that would be passed through a salt bridge into the cathode compartment where the biofilm is growing. And the electron would basically feed the biofilm. And you would need an extra input of CO2, and the output from the biofilm would be acetate. Research was just recently completed on food from EAB for Earth. The retail cost was determined to be $6 to $15 per dry kilogram, with a total capital expenditure of $5,600 to $9,300 per ton per annum. Now, even though this is looking like a more expensive alternative food, it still does have lower water and land use than conventional agriculture, so it still could have some use. However, more research is still needed in microbial electrosynthesis in order to reduce the cost. And then furthermore, they require rare metals. In space, the results are still being calculated, but in terms of preliminary results for ESM, we have a total setup mass to feed 5 people of just under 1,000 kilograms. The power is just under 3.5 kilowatts, and the onboard volume is 0.9 cubic meters. We've also recently discovered that EAB could even grow better in space than on Earth. So we could even get better results, but no research has been conducted yet for these bacteria in space. And then that third project that we're looking at is non-biological synthesis of food. There's 2 ways that we've been looking at non-biological synthesis, and that's in forming sugar and fats. Sugar, which of course is a carb. So basically what non-biological synthesis is, it's a physiochemical process that doesn't require living organisms. For the sugar process, you basically split water into hydrogen and combine it with carbon dioxide to produce formaldehyde, which can then be turned into sugar, C6 sugars for food. Unfortunately, current research shows that this would form a racemic mixture, which basically means that with every edible C6 sugar, there would be a mirror-like inedible C6 sugar, making it actually a toxic mixture to eat. So more research is needed for the feasibility of this food in order to separate the edible from inedible sugars. For the fat system, this is what the process diagram would look like for converting petroleum into synthetic fatty acids. And this was first established during, I believe, World War II, when they converted petroleum into fats. So basically, this process involves a lot of different steps of heating and catalyst addition and stirring to separate the targeted fatty acids, synthetic fatty acids, from the petroleum wax. And then, somewhat importantly, it also includes recyclability of waste matter. The purified synthetic fatty acids from that upstream section would then be subjected to esterification and with glycerol to produce edible triglycerides. The reaction may or may not use a catalyst. It is important to note that with uncatalyzed esterification, there are significant advantages like continuous operation. So now I'll conclude with some other food costs and the finishing thoughts on these alternative foods. Some examples of other food costs that have been completed, and these are in today dollars. Methane digesting bacteria, according to this, would be our lowest food source at $1.10 per dry kilogram. And a person could afford this if they made $200 a year. Something else that we looked at was greenhouse. So greenhouse grain would be $4 per dry kilogram, and you would need a salary of $800 per year in order to afford that food. And some of the more expensive ones, we talked about artificial light vegetables, which are $600 per dry kilogram, and you would need a salary of $110,000 per year in order to afford that food. And then the most expensive, we have oyster mushrooms at $800 per dry kilogram, and you need a salary of $150,000 per year in order to afford that food. So finishing thoughts, in terms of this research, optimists tend to ignore GCRs because they think that they might think that nothing bad, they're optimistic about the future, that a GCR won't occur. Pessimists, however, think that we can't do anything about a GCR, that we can't do anything to prevent it, and if it happens, then we won't be able to do anything to stop it. However, I think what this research shows is that if we can ramp up the least expensive alternative foods quickly enough, and if they cost at $1.31 per dry kilogram at retail, then 97% of people would be able to afford them. Some examples of a combination of foods include natural gas, SCP, cellulosic sugar, and protein leaf concentrate, seaweed farming, and potatoes that would be grown outdoors, not in the greenhouses. The greenhouses would be used so that rich people can eat anything they want energy efficiently, since we want to save that precious energy for other uses. And thank you for listening. Are there any more questions?
Well, yeah, I've got a question for you. So what kind of interested you in this topic to do this research? Is it something that's always interested you, or something that you kind of got the taste for, as it were, as you did research?
Yeah, it's something that I got a taste for, but yeah, I've always been interested in nutrition, so this was particularly interesting. And then also having a greater contribution to the world and applying engineering to it, certainly an honor to do that. And then, of course, working with researchers and scientists and engineers from around the world is also a privilege.
Was there anything in your research that you found particularly surprising?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably the fact that this is feasible, that's actually doable, that with conventional agriculture completely hindered, that there is actually a way to still feed all of the current population. So that's very promising.
Yeah, no, I had that thought myself. I was like, this is awesome. It's just kind of unexpectedly good news there. All right, I am going to wait a few more seconds, but it does look like that may be the end of our questions here.
Andrew, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Kyle, for this very informative presentation. So I just have a quick question. I was reading about agrivoltaic systems where solar arrays are combined with the greenhouses. So do you think solar arrays could be helpful in improving food resilience, or could they be integrated into your what you called low tech designs?
Yeah, that could probably be useful to actually obviate the artificial light completely. If the solar arrays stored light into batteries, and instead of actually using energy production that could go to other uses, we use that to grow crops. And then, yeah, also for the crops that maybe weren't growing as well, then yeah, that could also be very useful to add to.
Thank you. And maybe I can ask one more question. Do you think your research can help those that are experiencing maybe electricity outage, maybe caused by hurricane and some natural disasters?
We have considered that, as even these smaller alternative foods could be useful for even rural communities in Alaska that might be off-grid. but still more research is needed into that. But yeah, in terms of refuges, these could definitely also be possible with the right energy source.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And those of you who are online, please feel free to ask questions. Just type in the chat window. And today's password is also food.
Yeah, we did have a comment online. Basically, you know, for the scenarios in which sunlight would be blocked in a certain kind of catastrophe, obviously, solar energy into electricity would be less possible. But yeah, it looks like that may be everything that we had. No more questions coming up here.
Great. So I would like to thank you again, Kyle, and thanks everyone who joined the presentation, the seminar today, and have a great rest of your day.